Thank you all very much for being here today. I'm Jane Pinsky, and I am director of the North Carolina Coalition for Lobbying and Government Reform. These days, the coalition is an odd beast in North Carolina politics because we bring together citizens from both the left and the right, several of whom are here to join us today. Start with the Reverend Dr. Earl Johnson, who is here on behalf of Common Cause North Carolina, and Mitch Kokai from the Locke Foundation. We are here, or as I would say, here we go again. Yogi Berra would say deja vu all over again. North Carolina redistricting is in the courts again. The litigation going on in the courtroom behind us is a byproduct of a very flawed redistricting process. Partisan redistricting is creating lawsuits, postponing elections, confusing voters, wasting our money on special sessions in the North Carolina General Assembly, and finally, and worst of all, it's undermining public confidence in our government. But we are not here today to discuss the litigation that is going on in the courtroom behind us. We are here today to say that there is a better way for North Carolina to do nonpartisan redistricting. There is a simple and readily available solution: passage of nonpartisan redistricting reform now in the North Carolina General Assembly. It would create fair and competitive districts by taking politics out of the process. It is a proposal that has widespread support from groups as varied as the Locke Foundation and Common Cause. It is time for the leadership of both political parties to stop this endless carousel of partisan redistricting. Reform is the answer, and the time for this is now. On that note, I'm going to introduce Mitch Kokai from the Locke Foundation, and then Reverend Johnson. Then we'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks for the opportunity to join in this. And as Jane mentioned, this is an idea that should not be partisan. At times it is seen as being partisan for the party that is out of power. For years, when Democrats were in control of the levers of state government, you heard mainly Republicans talking about redistricting reform. Now that Republicans are in charge, you're hearing louder cries for redistricting reform from the Democrats, but it's something that should be touted by people from both parties. And one of the reasons why redistricting reform is so important is that there is a basic principle involved. We hear a lot these days about politics. It's a big election year. Most everything that's happening in Raleigh, in DC, throughout much of the country is about politics. But this is about principle. And the principle involved is that voters must retain the ultimate sovereignty in any representative government. To put it more simply, voters should choose their representatives. Representatives shouldn't be choosing their voters. As Jane mentioned, this is not about the current legal challenge that's taking place right back here. This is a long-standing issue. In preparing for this news conference, I looked back at some of the news columns we've written about this issue, specifically about one from 2002, when there was a huge redistricting fight, when Democrats had drawn districts and Republicans were challenging it. Another was from 2006, when basically the idea was, okay, Democrats, this is a good time to have redistricting reform. When you've got a chance, you're not right before a census, this is a good time to do it. The other column was from 2010, just after the election, when Republicans had won, and the president of the Locke Foundation at the time said, look, Republicans, we know you're going to have a temptation to do exactly what the Democrats did before. Don't do it. Put a system in place that has an independent, nonpartisan nature to it. These districts that are being challenged now were drawn in 2011. They've already survived some legal challenges in the past. We've had 2 elections already under these districts. Now, this court may throw out the districts, which would mean that you'd had one set of courts saying the districts were fine, another saying the districts aren't fine. This is an issue that goes beyond this particular case. So if the election districts withstand this latest challenge and basically get through a second round of court cases, we'll still benefit in North Carolina from redistricting reform. Some people are asking, okay, if the partisan lawmakers don't draw the districts, who should do it? Should it be an independent commission? Should it be specially designated legislative staff? Well, there's room to maneuver and to come up with an agreement that everyone can live with on that. But the key is good rules, rules that limit the prospects of map-making mischief. You want clear, neutral, legally binding principles that are in play in this process. Things like compactness, things like minimizing the division of jurisdiction lines like county lines and municipal lines. A population roughly equal among the districts. Now, we have already some of these principles in place thanks to previous court cases, but there are some others that we don't have in place that we would benefit from, like no protection of incumbents when you're drawing the lines, or no consideration of political party registration when you're drawing these lines. These are the types of principles we'd benefit from. The criteria should be largely numerical, and that sounds fancier than it needs to be, but we're talking about quantitative more than qualitative. You want to minimize the discretion that the map makers, whoever they are, have to draw the lines. And you want to reduce the potential for future lawsuits like the one that we're dealing with right now. Now, some people have said that in this day and age, computers could draw these districts. Well, I think if you have an independent redistricting commission, or if it's done by legislative staff specially appointed for that task, and they are held to legally binding rules, good rules that limit their discretion, you're going to end up with something that's a lot like what a computer would have generated instead of what we get whether Democrats or Republicans are in charge and drawing their own districts. And that is districts that no one feels confident really reflect the way that North Carolinians want to be represented. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. I just want to correct one thing. The oldest Carolina Journal article, the John Locke Foundation publication that I can find that advocates for nonpartisan redistricting goes back to 1992. And it, in fact, was that article that set us on this path of finding clear criteria. The first legislation was proposed, I believe it is now, about 45 years ago. So this is not a quick process, but we would like to see it in place by 2021. Our next speaker is the Reverend Dr. Earl Johnson, representing Common Cause North Carolina.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you all for being here. And I think I want to take you down a different path. According to a New York Times article I read last week, the legislators kind of rushed into drawing the maps that we have today that are in the court litigation today, and the two districts that's in play for us will be the first district, congressional district, and the 12th congressional districts, which were what we consider drawn along racial lines, and have been ruled unconstitutional by this federal district court. The first and 12th districts packs African Americans voters together so their political power is diluted. And I call on pastors from Greensboro, Winston-Salem, this entire area, to somewhat educate their congregations on what has taken place in districts 1 and 12. And not only those districts, but all districts that disenfranchise people throughout our state. The justices themselves call the gerrymandering of these districts blatant racial quota, is what they call them. So the curse of partition and racial gerrymandering drives a stake in the hearts of North Carolinians who want fair elections. The court found that the 12th district and the 1st district were the worst, at least the 12th district was the worst gerrymandered district in any state in America. If a stay should come from this court or the Supreme Court, another election could unfortunately go forth in which black voters remain hobbled and, of course, disenfranchised. So HB 2, which was passed recently, was passed by individuals who were in districts that had no competition, where they had no competition, or in election districts where they could easily win over and over again. As you noticed yesterday, one of the Republicans came out and said that he should not have voted for HB 12, but because he could do so in the district that he was in with no opposition, no complaints, he went along and did it. It is just another machination of disenfranchising African American voters, Latino voters, and discrimination to others as well. So Common Cause of North Carolina has been a voice for improving how we do redistricting in North Carolina. They have been on the front line, on the front edge for years to come, and they will continue to do so. They have stated over and over again that politics should have no place or no part in the process because it creates gerrymandered districts that are non-competitive and marginalizes the voice of all voters, and especially African Americans. And this is so true on the local level. Democracy is supposed to be one person, one vote, but when there's no choice in our elections, the people have no voice. That's why we at Common Cause support redistricting reform, believing that we need a system that allows citizens to choose their representatives rather than their representatives choosing them. And I thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Reverend Johnson. I just have to take something from what the Reverend said to point out how nonpartisan our battle is. The 12th Congressional District, which indeed does win awards for one of the worst congressional districts in the country, was drawn by Democrats, the first by Republicans. So both sides are right. Doing it wrong. We're going to take questions, but before we do, I just want to thank Walter Salinger, who is from Greensboro and chair of the League of Women Voters Fair Elections Committee, and some of his colleagues who've come to join us today. And Mr. Salinger will be available to answer questions as well. So, are there any questions?
Jane, can you mention a state that is ahead of us in this process that has independent redistricting, and what's the result of that?
Well, there are a few states that do it. There are a number of states that have what people call independent redistricting commissions, but unfortunately those tend to be political appointees. Our personal favorite would be the state of Iowa, which has the redistricting done by staff, as Mr. Kokai said. The thing about Iowa is that they have very strict criteria, and frankly, with that criteria, anybody could draw maps that were nonpartisan. The strictest of those criteria is the fact that you cannot look at where an incumbent or challenger lives, the political registration of a district, the voter registration of the district, the voter turnout, and the results of past elections. So basically, they draw maps that represent people based on where they live. They also respect state and federal law, which means in North Carolina we would respect the Voting Rights Act so that our minority populations would be protected, and we would, as much as possible, follow the whole county rule from the Stevenson case. So our very first choice would be Iowa, because it does take the politics out of it. In the end, the North Carolina legislature would get to vote these maps up or down, but they would be maps drawn by independent bodies.
So why bring this poll down? Why not?
Well, this is now because my coalition, which was founded in 2005, has been doing this since 2005. We were founded to bring accountability and transparency to government, and without nonpartisan redistricting, we are going to get neither. We need a government where citizens know that they can hold their elected officials accountable, and if you're elected by a 10, 15, or 20% margin, you don't have to feel that you're accountable. Mitch, do you want to add something? You've been doing it even longer than us.
I mean, this is an issue that is going to be relevant until the General Assembly finally decides it's in its interest to go ahead and make this change. I mean, for years and years, Democrats who were in charge of the General Assembly thought, well, we don't have to do anything about it because we're in charge, we're going to be in charge, we don't have to worry about it. Well, they were surprised by the 2010 election, which just happened to be the last election before the census and before the next redistricting. And that's why I referenced right after that 2010 election, when Republicans won big majorities, we said, hey, look, we know you're going to have the temptation to do the same thing to Democrats that they did to you. Resist that temptation, because at some point the pendulum's going to swing back. People, even if you have districts that favor you, people are going to favor putting Democrats back in charge. You want to make sure that the process is such that you're not going to be have your actual representation muted because of bad districts, which I think is what the Democrats are rightly complaining about now, what Republicans rightly complained about for decades and decades. So it's an issue that needs to be brought to the fore each time there's an opportunity, until the folks in charge get the message that, yes, this is something we need to do.
And can I say also that it's also an issue for the African American community, in the sense that the voter law that was passed several years ago is one of the worst voting laws ever passed since Reconstruction. And that had to do with gerrymandering. They had to do with the drawing of the districts. The only way that could possibly take place was through gerrymandering. And so I say that it's very important that both sides, not just one side, not just Democrat or Republican, but both sides need to come together and work out an idea. As the gentleman said, how do we do that? We can figure out a way to do it, but it needs to be done. People need to come together and work through it, so they won't be choosing who they want to vote for them, rather than allowing the American people who have a right to vote for the candidate of their choice. Right now, we have no choice. We have to vote for the person who is drawn into a district, and we may not know who the person is, may not like the person, may not want to vote for the person, but we have no other choice, because the system has been, as Donald Trump said yesterday, has been rigged. So we cannot vote for the person that we would want to vote for. And so even if we wanted to vote for someone else who ran against someone in that district, the odds of them winning are very, very slim. So that's what I'm saying. We have gone too far in disenfranchising African Americans and the minorities, and something really needs to be done about that. And Jane, in Common Cause, is on the cutting edge of trying to do something about that.
I should point out that in 2011, the North Carolina House of Representatives agreed with us and passed nonpartisan redistricting legislation. It passed overwhelmingly by a bipartisan vote of 89 to 27. The North Carolina Senate refused to take it up. The North Carolina House has the votes if they knew that the Senate would move it. So this is not a new battle, and one that we will keep doing until we have victory. And just to point out, we think both parties should be looking at this as an insurance policy, because we don't know what North Carolina is going to look like by 2020 and 2021. And the party in power may no longer be the party in power in 2021 or 2031, and the people of North Carolina would benefit from a fair system, and we think in the long run, so would the parties. Are there other questions?
Can you explain the process of making sure that politicians don't have anything to do with the redistricting process?
Sure. In most states where there's either an independent redistricting commission or the process that they use in Iowa, the commission members or the commission staff are prohibited from speaking with elected officials. They also, where there is a commission, prohibit anyone who is related to someone in office or who is or has recently been an officer of a political party from serving on those commissions. In fact, in Iowa, they take their staff to an office building someplace in Des Moines, and no one knows where they are. The door's locked, they don't let the janitor in, and they draw the maps. The other thing that we would like in the process is that it get done quickly. North Carolina redistricting in 2001 lasted till 2009, and even when it's done in a session, it can last months and months and months, which means it gets entangled in regular business. We'd like redistricting done on a tight timeline so that they can, in the proper year, do the redistricting and then move on to the people's business.
Can I add something to that too?
Oh, be my guest.
That's also why we've always emphasized, more than who draws the maps, that you rely on rules. You have some binding rules that will limit the mischief that whoever's drawing the rules could get in, drawing the maps could get into. Because if you have the rules like the compactness, no protection of incumbents or benefits for potential challengers, no reference to party affiliation of the people who live in the potential districts, then it's going to be less likely that you're going to have districts drawn to help a particular person or hurt a particular person, help a particular group, hurt a particular group. You're going to have districts that will be fairly compact and that will actually serve communities of interest. So the rules, however the process is put in place, the rules are very important.
I just wanted to
Come
add.
up to the mic.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that with the Iowa model, we have more than a decade, almost 2 decades of experience. And one of the things that we know from the Iowa experience is that whereas they were troubled with lawsuits in the same way that North Carolina still is around the redistricting process, since they passed the reform, they've had no lawsuits since 2010. It's a wonderfully tranquil and effective way of doing business in comparison to the mayhem that we have.
Are there any other questions? Right. We'll be around for a minute or two if you think of anything else. Really appreciate your coming. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jane. Excellent.
Thanks, Mitch.
Good to see you. Good to meet you.
Thank you.